A very good evening to all our viewers. Welcome to tonight's edition of The Agenda. My name is Taiwan Jabala, your host. Tonight on the show, we are talking corporate governance. There's been a lot of issues in the country lately, headlines about ministers and boards and CEOs clashing over whose authority is being trampled upon as far as some of those positions are concerned. And to help us unpack this subject is Ernestine Tuneeko. She is a corporate governance practitioner. Thank you very much for being with us, Ernestine.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, as well as, of course, Steve Galloway, who is himself a very veteran of the space of corporate governance. He works mostly now as an independent director on different boards. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Toya. Good to be here.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, let's start with you, Steve. Perhaps just corporate governance. It's such a buzzword. Everybody talks about it, and we don't seem to comprehend it so well in Namibia. If what is happening on the ground is anything to go by, what is it, and why is it so important, especially to a country like ours?
Yeah, I think the buzzword is in the corporate, and I think it's a little bit misleading because it's not just for corporates.
Yeah.
It's for all organizations.
Mm-hmm.
It really should be called organizational governance.
Yeah.
And the reason why it's in the press all the time is because very few organizations take it seriously because they think it's just for the big corporates.
Yeah.
And that's why we have so many corporate governance or organizational governance failures that we read about every day.
Yeah. Indeed. Ernestine, why is it, because businesses, Steve put it very well by saying, we must apply it more broadly and not just to your sort of A-list corporates. Why is it important to have it across the board in a country like ours?
I think it's important because any organization is set up for the purpose of doing business.
Yeah.
And really, I think the end result is always to make money, to make profit, to deal with your customers, address the stakeholders that you're engaged in.
Yeah.
So it's important that whatever manner you choose to manage a company,
Yeah.
it must really be in terms of good governance for the benefit of all stakeholders that are involved, whether it's in your community, your employees, your customers, and so on.
And Steve, do we have, because we know, for example, that there's the State-Owned Enterprises Governance Act that sort of is the framework for how to govern public enterprises, but for the private sector, for example, what do they rely on? What tools do they rely on?
Yeah, the issue with governance codes is that they're normally voluntary. So you have a Companies Act, in any country you'll have a Companies Act, and that's of course the law. So you have to comply with the Companies Act, and there's quite a lot of corporate governance there. But the overriding corporate governance frameworks, often called codes, are the things that companies need to sort of believe in. Some of them are very complicated, and we've come a long way over the last 30 or 40 years. So the complicated ones, the Cadbury codes, the OECD codes, the IFC, and so on, were very much tick box, compliance, rules-based corporate governance.
Yeah.
What we call now outcomes-based governance is much simpler. And you simply go and look at a few key outcomes in any organization, in any governing body of any organization, and you measure your success, if you like, according to those outcomes. Because the input-based, principles-based corporate governance codes, the Cadburys, etc., and by the way, including our NAM code, is quite complicated. It's 76 principles, and very few entities get their heads around that. And that's why it's the sort of default of big corporates. They can handle that, but everybody else can't handle that. And that's why we're advising outcomes-based, simpler, more applicable, more proportionate type of governance, which you can apply to any organization.
And Ernestine, I mean, you've served on some boards of particularly SOEs, the public enterprises, and I don't know whether the attention is on public enterprises mostly because, of course, they are public, they owe us that explanation, but we don't see a lot of sort of squabbling within the private sector, or maybe we don't pay enough attention because it's not our money. What seems to be the challenge within the public space as far as corporate governance is concerned?
Public enterprises are actually set up to provide services to the public. Government establishes these institutions to actually help with development, implementation of government policies. So in the process of appointing boards, I think it's important that the line ministry or the Ministry of Public Enterprises actually ensures that we have competent, skilled and experienced directors, because that's actually the group of people who are actually going to lead the institution. So that's where you start, to ensure that you have ethical directors who are competent and can actually direct management in how to run the company. So I think some of the reasons why we have problems is either we don't choose the right people to sit on boards, so they don't know how to run a public enterprise, they don't know how to run a business for that matter. And if the board is not competent, ethical or effective, they cannot impart instructions or knowledge to the management to actually then run the institution correctly. So I think at all layers of governance, there's a need for ethical leadership, proper competence, understanding of the business, to ensure that the mandate of the SO is actually then carried through.
There is one of the recurring challenges that I've observed in this in that space is personality clashes, and in my conversations with a lot of people, you have people saying, for example, that if you are serving on a board, there ought to be some sort of threshold to say, for example, that for you to oversee, as a board member, to oversee a CEO, you must be yourself either a CEO or a senior manager where you work full-time if you are still in full-time employment, instead of having a junior being appointed to the board and then come and supervise a senior in the person of the CEO. Is there any credibility to such claims?
I would tend to say no, because when a board member, whether it's a chairperson or what other capacity they are appointed, if you choose the right people in terms of experience, knowledge, and understanding of the business, they should actually come with that authority when they deal with a CEO. So it comes with experience and maturity on how you handle conflicts or issues. So the issue of whether the one person is more senior than the other should not really play a role, because you are in a professional setup. You're really there for the interest of the company. So all the personal issues and whether who earns more or who is more senior should not really play a role. I think that's an ideal situation. Yeah.
Steve, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think the key is that on a board you look for diversity of skills, of gender, of race, of demographics, etc. And you need young people on boards. And that particular young person is on the board is chosen not just to tick the box of youth, but to bring certain skills. So those skills that person brings to the board are valuable to the board and makes the board operate more efficiently. You don't want to be in a situation where a CEO is instructed to do something by an individual board member, because an individual board member has no power. It's the board that has power. And it's that unique skill that all the members of the board bring to the board, which must add value and must be able to say to the CEO, this is how you must operate. The board collectively has that authority, not an individual.
It's a good point, as a matter of fact, because I think people look at individuals and say, but this boy, he was just doing law a couple of years ago. Now he's the sort of legal representative on the board, and he's coming around, giving me instructions, and I'm a veteran executive and stuff like that, and then you have that kind of conflict. But the Ministry of Public Enterprises is in the process of being sort of disbanded to be converted into a directorate within the Ministry of Finance. I thought personally that it was a necessary portfolio to have independently, instead of just sort of downgrading it into a directorate. What do you think of that move by government, Steve?
I always expected the move. I didn't expect it so soon. So the first move of setting up the Public Enterprise Governance Act and moving governance into a central body made a lot of sense, because the fragmented governance through line ministries was not working.
Yeah.
So I supported that, and I thought it would take 3 or 4 years to get to the stage of maturity where you could both realign SOEs, public enterprises, restructure some of them, privatize some of them, etc. I thought that shakeout process would take 3 or 4 years, and then, as stated, a holding company would be set up. Now that process has been accelerated, and I just hope that we give the sufficient attention to it within the Ministry of Finance. I think it makes sense to be in the Ministry of Finance, but I just hope we've got enough resources to actually follow through on the restructuring, the fine-tuning of purpose, of strategic plans, etc. Because if there's not enough resources allocated to that, we're going to revert back to some of the same problems we had before.
Yeah, Ernestine, on that, I mean, if you're a board member and you have this big issue that you are grappling with as a collective board, until recently you would write a letter maybe to Leon Eusted and ask for guidance. Now you're writing to some director in the Ministry of Finance. How would that pan out?
I don't really think it's much of a change, because I think even under the Ministry of Public Enterprises, I mean, there were structures in how issues are addressed. For example, if a public enterprise has a concern about, say, understanding about board remuneration, you will still address the letter to, say, the executive director, who would then make sure that whether it's the legal person in the ministry or the finance person, whatever the issue is, would then address it. But obviously, there are certain issues, and I agree with your point, where as a board, you want to actually sit with the minister and address certain issues that the company is grappling with. And yeah, I think in the current setup, you then have to meet with the Minister of Finance. And hopefully, yes, he can then have the time to deal with all the SOEs that would fall under his ministry to then address it. Yeah.
That was my point about resources. I think the authority is there. I think the Minister of Finance is the right person. The question is, does he have enough resources within his ministry? And I think he needs a dedicated team, like the former minister had at one time. He needs a dedicated team. But issues of significance and importance must escalate to the minister himself. He's the authority. And perhaps the solution is to have a deputy minister of public enterprises. Maybe that's the solution. But the authority is the minister. And he holds the treasury keys. So it's important to be there.
I think that the idea of a deputy minister heading that particular portfolio is important. It could work. I mean, we know, for example, that in the presidency they have numerous deputy ministers. I mean, for example, veteran affairs, it used to be a ministry. Now it has been converged into the Ministry of Defense, but the deputy minister is heading strictly veteran affairs. So it sort of sounds like still a minister on his own. Maybe it's a model that can work, but I seriously think that the SOE space is so muddy that it needs really particular attention and not some sort of by the way kind of directorate within a ministry. We will go for a quick break and then return for second half. We continue our conversation with Ernestine and Steve. Let's talk, Ernestine, why our public enterprises are struggling. I know that it ought to be a cocktail of many issues, probably including governance itself. But as someone who operates in that space yourself, what is sort of the thematic issue, the recurring issue, why we seem to have a lot of challenges in the public, in the PE space?
I think the challenges are various, and some of them are also very historical. And I think one of the biggest one is really the legacy of poor financial management. So that leads to a situation where the entity does not have money to actually run its business and actually carry out its mandate. And obviously, financial difficulty or challenges that they face it has a story, and sometimes the story relates to either poor internal controls, the way procurement is done, where you don't always get the best price, or where you want to start a project and the tenderer it does not come on board, so you actually lose money in the process of either buying infrastructure to move the business forward. So it's really a few issues that culminates into a bigger issue and then makes the entity not profitable. Obviously, the management talks to issues of internal audit, internal controls. You get some SOEs where you don't even have annual reports that have not been published for 5 years. So that actually talks to a lack of either it's internal controls, something is just not being governed properly. And then sometimes you get a new board that you feel is competent, but then there are so many legacy issues when they come in. And in the period of, say, 2 to 3 years that they are there, you can only make so many inroads. And then you still continue to be classified as a poor performing institution while you actually have competent directors. But they come in and they face so many challenges, whether it's maybe a non-cooperative management or just finances that are not there, or the banks cannot even finance the institution because either you don't have a strategy that you can actually piggyback on to get funding. And good, I mean, investors want to invest in good performing entities. So, and also we know that government does not have enough money now. You need to budget for education and health and so on. So the pie has become small to just give money to public enterprises to be able to function.
Yeah. Speaking of legacy issues, Steve, there's been, until the creation of the Public Enterprises Ministry a few years ago, there wasn't really a proper framework in how to appoint board directors, for example. It was a very political space where you just say, oh, it's a cadre, it's a party cadre, therefore we are going to appoint them as a board member. Do you think that has let us down over the years, that maybe it contributed to some of the challenges that we face today?
Absolutely. That was the common practice when governance was practiced through line ministries. And I'll tell you a story. Mervyn King, who's the famous protagonist of corporate governance and who's introduced now King 4, which is this outcomes-based governance. Yeah. He spent a lot of time here in 2019, just before the Public Enterprise Governance Act came into being. And I remember a room full of 100 or so management and directors of public entities. And he asked a few questions. They were representing probably 20 public entities. He asked a few questions. He said, who appoints your boards? Your CEO? And of course the answer at that time was the minister. The line minister appoints the boards, the chairman, and often the CEO as well, which is all wrong in terms of that governance model. And then he posed the question. He said, how many of you, and 100 people there, have not had this experience where before a board meeting, typically the chair gets a call from the minister and says, the shareholder would like the following to happen. And not one single person put up their hands to say this has not happened. He said, I was asked this morning to give you a sort of a snapshot of how corporate governance is working in the public sector. And from what I've seen here, it's very, very bad. And it's because of that legacy issue where ministers appoint chairs and therefore feel that they can instruct the chair what to do. And another corporate governance guru, Patrick Chisanga from Zambia, gave a horror story of an airline that was told where to fly by politicians. And he went to the point very quickly and said, it is the CEO of that airline that now sits in jail, not the politicians who instructed that airline to fly somewhere. Yeah. So you have all these horror stories coming out because of those legacy issues.
Yeah, but now the story of Patrick that you just mentioned there, isn't it poetic that we're talking about that, and we had a similar situation at Air Namibia, for example, where the leadership, probably the executive and the board, were in agreement that the Frankfurt route was loss-making, and it was actually the Achilles heel of the airline. And politicians kept saying, no, we need tourists here, we need German tourists to come around. As if to say that if that route was discontinued, a person seated in Munich wanting to visit Namibia will not come because of that, when there are so many other options. Isn't it then the case that there are so many times when people like yourselves as directors speak sort of sense into your appointing authorities, but for some reason the sensible commercial reasons are they are dismissed and replaced with political reasons?
Absolutely, and that's a very relevant case. After that meeting I referred to Mervyn King and Patrick Chisanga, Mervyn had a meeting with the Minister of Public Enterprise, and they took their Namibia case as a test. And Mervyn's recommendation was that directors who had made decisions to do things which were clearly irresponsible or at least commercially unviable should be personally liable for those decisions that they made. The concept of personal liability of directors is very important. And no director and no board should be taking instructions from the shareholder, whether it be a private shareholder or a government shareholder, if they know that what they're doing is reckless. They must bear personal responsibility for that, or resign.
Yeah, sure.
And some did that.
Thank you, Steve. So, Ernestine, how often have you or your fellow board members at a particular entity stood your ground and say, but Minister, sorry you appointed us into this position, but it is our function to steer this entity into a right direction, and therefore what you are saying now to us, your instruction to us, we are not going to carry it out. Are you even allowed to do that? Or there's that sort of intimidatory environment where you think if you say no, then you're in trouble, you'll be removed?
I think it talks a lot to the competence and the maturity of the board to actually take that kind of stand. But personally, no, I've not actually been involved in such a situation. But it's actually what we strive towards in Namibia, to ensure that we get those caliber directors to actually make those hard decisions and actually even be prepared to resign if really they feel that the instructions from the minister is not in the best interest of the company. But personally, no, I've not been faced with such a challenge.
Yeah, I'm asking this because in the past week, or maybe 2 weeks now, there's a story running in the papers about the Namibia Sports Commission, where the chief administrator, who's essentially the CEO, the board there said, they assessed him. They hired an independent consultant, and together with the board, they assessed the performance of the CEO. And based on the outcome of that exercise, they then recommended for his reappointment on a new 5-year term, and the minister does not agree. She's asking that the position be advertised. And it has caused so much debate in the country to say, but who has the power? Maybe the first question that I must ask Steve is, because it looks as if each entity has, of course, its own founding act, especially the SOEs, and that we don't seem to have a harmonized way of saying, because for Namibia you are told the minister has the final say, for Sports Commission you are told the board feels that they have the final say. How disintegrated is sort of the governance framework that we don't seem to have a uniform approach?
The general approach, as I mentioned in the various codes, which are largely voluntary, is that the shareholder, be that government or a private shareholder, appoints a board and entrusts that board with running the company according to broad guidelines. The CEO must be appointed by the board so that the board can have accountability for that CEO and the other way around. That's the general rule. In the Public Enterprise Governance Act, there's still some grey areas. And because we've come from that line ministry governance framework to this new mixed framework, I would say, hybrid framework, there's still a little bit too much, in my view, discretion by the minister. I think we are trying in most SOEs now, public enterprises, to follow the good practice of a board being appointed with guidelines, and there's a governance agreement in the Act, and there's a performance agreement in the Act. But government, through the shareholder and the minister, should not be interfering all the time. There is some scope in the Act still for the minister, that's the Minister of Public Enterprises, advised by the line minister still, to intervene a little bit too much. And it's still a grey area. So I don't know the actual facts around this particular case, or for that matter around the Irongo Red case, where there's this very grey area, but it's bad practice to override a board on a CEO appointment or renewal, unless there's really a good reason to do so.
Yeah, because look, I am saying also that my view is that if the minister sees that there's an extraordinary anomaly in the reappointment of a CEO, to say, but comrades, how do you appoint this person? They have pending disciplinary cases, or they have a pending case at the ACC. Maybe there you can say there's an extraordinary situation. But in some cases, Ernestine, in your experience, I mean, isn't it even dangerous if you as a board are presiding over a CEO who feels that they were appointed by the minister, and therefore they can even undermine your authority as a board?
Yeah, exactly, and I think that's what Steve alluded to. But with regard to the particular case that you mentioned, I think there's a need for appointing authority to actually understand their statutes and the powers that are vested in them when they take certain decisions. Because it will actually avoid some of these problems, because when you have a clear demarcation of authority, you know where the minister's powers start and end, as well as the board, you can actually then not have these kind of cases. So maybe it's also an understanding of what am I allowed to do as a minister, and what are the powers of the board.
One of the things now, as SOEs continue to struggle, Steve, I think the public, sorry for my choice of words, but the public seems to be fed up with a lot of these SOEs, and they want them privatized or become PPP sort of ventures. What is the right model, especially for non-performing SOEs?
There are a range of models, Trevor, and everybody is sort of going to PPPs as the panacea now. And it's not the answer for everything. PPP is a fairly complicated framework, well devised and set up in the PPP Act of 2017. But it's certainly not the answer to all of the public enterprise issues. So PPP is designed to deliver services in a more efficient way to the public by sharing the risk on a project. But at no point should the price of that service increase. And that's the sort of rigor of the PPP process, to do what we call a public sector comparator and to justify the case of value for money. So if NAM Water is doing water, if there's another way of delivering water through a PPP, it must deliver water cheaper, more efficiently, more effectively, and there must be a clear case for value for money for doing that. It mustn't just be a default that a particular SOE is not coping, so let's throw it to the private sector. Because what often happens there is that the price goes up and the efficiency doesn't necessarily increase. So you've got to be very careful what you put into the PPP framework.
Indeed. Do you have any thoughts on that, Ernestine, in terms of the calls to privatize some of the entities?
I think government must actually look at what is actually the mandate of particular SOEs, and then make a decision to say, look, yeah, this one, in terms of the way it's been performing, it's going to be in the best interest of the country to actually privatize. So there must be a business case to actually make that decision.
Yeah, and it's going to be a challenge, Ernestine, isn't it? We saw what happened with Air Namibia when they were liquidated, and everybody interpreted that development in their own way. A lot of people thinking it's just a way to that some people are conniving behind the scenes to bring down the company so that the private players can take on. So you'll also have then to deal with a lot of political connotations if you were to privatize any of these entities, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it should be, you should look at all the players involved to make sure that whatever final decision is taken, it's actually in the best interest of either the company or the employees. Well, it can never be in the interest of employees to actually lose a job, but it must be in the best interest of the company whenever you make that decision. Because as we know, there were resources that were allocated to Air Namibia that could have actually gone to social issues. So those are some of the public sentiments why they feel maybe it was the right decision to actually then liquidate Air Namibia.
Yeah. We go for the second break and then return for the final half of the show. We continue with my guests. Steve, there's the issue of, you earlier on slightly alluded to the situation at Erongo Red, and that is, what we are hearing there in that case is that the CEO was granted a 5-year contract. That 5-year contract has ended, and now he's dragging the board to court because he feels he didn't do too bad, and therefore they should have. He has a case for renewal, and we see a lot of this, behaviors in the particularly the SOE space. Why is that the case? Why is it that people cannot just respect the contractual agreements and say once that has ended, that's it?
Yeah, I mean, you quote a specific case, and I don't know whether the board followed the rules or not. what I read in the newspaper is that he was supposed to have been given 6 months' notice if he was not to be renewed. They're saying that he had the opportunity to apply again. But it's again, lack of clarity on who does what and what the expectations are in terms of contracts. The governance guides, as I keep saying, are voluntary practice guides. But you've got to stick to the law of your contracts, and if you haven't done that, then you're in trouble. But again, not knowing all the detail, I don't think it's the minister's prerogative to intervene. Those two parties must sort out their differences. And it shouldn't escalate to ministers, because it's the board's responsibility to run that entity and to interact with the CEO and to run processes. And unfortunately, these things often become political. And a shareholder can never have that level of insight into what's really happening. The board must take responsibility.
What is the best practice? Again, I'm referring to the case of the Namibia Sports Commission. One of the arguments that the board put out was to say, the case they were making to the minister was to say, it is almost a tradition within the SOE space in particular that if you serve for 5 years only as a CEO, that somehow, unless there are major issues, you ought to be still considered. Maybe not even, do you have to re-advertise the position so that the incumbent must apply again? And what is the best practice?
I think Steve alluded to the need for us to actually stick to the contracts. If you get a 5-year contract, and you know that after a certain period you cease to be CEO, I think it's something that should be respected. Obviously, looking at possible clauses in the contract where you are then, maybe the board or the company is required to notify you of their intention not to renew your contract, those are also provisions that the board must comply to, so that you know, and you know that you have to start making other plans in terms of looking for another job. But as a country, I don't think we should actually create situations where positions are then almost reserved for certain people. I think that there should be the idea that anybody can compete for a particular position. But as I said, contract terms must be adhered to. And I think it's just fair that as the CEO is actually then notified what is the board's intention with regard to him, whether he's then allowed to reapply or they are just going to renew his contract automatically. Those are discussions that must take place between the board. And some of these issues, when you read between the lines, it's really, I think it talks to somehow a lack of communication, or maybe some relationships that are not very cordial between the board and the particular CEO. And those ones need to be addressed as well.
Yeah. Do we need, in a situation like that then, because again, and I keep bringing up the issue of the Namibia Sports Commission because I suppose it's the most recent case, and it's quite a classical case in so many ways. So, do we need to have a framework that is clear on those things to say you are on a 5-year contract, after that contract has ended, this is the way forward, like it's in black and white? Or do we just make it circumstantial to say, oh no, in this case because for the Namibia Sports Commission board, one of the things that they pointed out was to say that the minister presides over a number of public entities under her ministry. They talked about how the director of the National Youth Council she just got a renewal. Her contract ended. The board recommended to the minister that the contract be renewed. The minister agreed. In this particular case, she said it must be advertised, which makes the minister look like she's playing double standards, whether that is perceived or real. Do we need a framework that speaks exactly to what must happen, or do we just leave it the way it is and then open ourselves up for all kinds of accusations?
I think my view on that is we must look at the sphere of contract law. I mean, it's a private law sphere, and therefore contracts must be handled in that kind of manner. To say you enter into a contract with a board, these are the terms, and the terms must be respected. I don't know whether I will actually support the setting up of a framework, because cases must also be handled on a case-to-case basis, and whether the minister then made a decision in regard to the one case different to the other, we have to look at all the facts that are involved. But really, I think my take on it is that you must just enter into a contract and actually just comply to whatever the terms of the contracts are.
And still, one of the issues again is, of course, with the Leon used amendments and the framework that he put up to say now that people must apply for public for board positions, and I think they can even be interviewed for that. I think it has brought an element of sanity there, but still, how transparent are these appointments? There was a case of the former mayor of Windhoek, Joba Mpanda, talking about having applied for a board position at the I think it's called the Namibia Commission of Research, Sciences, Technology, and he seems to have been interviewed and everything went well, and then the minister for some reason decided that he was not the right guy to be included on that board. I mean, how transparent is the process generally?
I think, based on the anecdotal evidence I gave you about the meeting that Mervyn King had, was that it wasn't transparent at all at that time. That was mid-2019, is that line ministers generally would just pick people. That process has improved a lot. And as you say, the pool of directors, candidate directors that the Ministry of Public Enterprise put up took us quite a long way. So we started a proper process of actually interviewing people, vetting people, but I think there's still some interference in the system. And one of the concerns that the Minister of Public Enterprise has often expressed was that he's not getting the people he wants onto those panels, because there was a general negative stigma about being on a public enterprise board. So he wasn't getting the people. So I think he had no option but to approach certain people and say, will you apply? Yeah. In an ideal world, you pick the best people for the job. It's hard to fault what did happen was that, maybe in the process, the top 6 candidates were all similar candidates. Yeah. And I think government, and any shareholder for that matter, must be able to go outside that pool and say, we need this skill and that skill and that skill. But the danger always is that you go and pick individuals who might be connected or the right individual to take your instructions. That's always the danger. But I don't think it's hard and fast. I don't think it's just an interview process. I think to create a balanced board, you need to sometimes mix and match. And as long as that process is transparent and you can justify the skills of those people, then you get there. But we're in a transition, and it'll take a while before we get to the right outcomes.
Yeah. Ernestine, the issue of political appointments. There used to be there's a huge perception out there that for you to be appointed the CEO of a public enterprise in this country, you ought to be a SWAPO card-carrying member. The same used to be the case with board appointments. Maybe that has slightly changed now because people have to apply for those board positions, but there's still this perception that if you and I come out 50-50 and I'm the SWAPO card-carrying member and you are not, the position of that board position is likely to be given to me. What is your observation?
I think I would tend to believe that with the new process that we have, that creates a bit more transparency in where people are actually then interviewed and they are chosen based on their skills and competence, that those issues are hopefully issues of the past. I don't really have like specific knowledge in terms of particular cases that we can actually refer to, but I think we must trust the system and actually give it time to actually mature so that we can actually see the results in the way boards are appointed and actually how PEs are actually then performing because of good governance and proper boards that are in place.
Yeah. In that line, Steve, what used to be said some years ago, I think that narrative has changed a little bit, but they used to say that, you need to be a card-carrying member of the ruling party because the ruling party has a manifesto and they want people that affiliate and sort of, are sympathetic towards what is in that manifesto. That was the argument peddled in the olden days to say, we need cadres, we need people who can drive this process in line with the SWAPO policies and whatnot. What has been your observation, and has it set us back a little bit where if you couldn't produce a political party card, you couldn't get those jobs?
It might well have been the case, but however, I've worked in government from the day of independence, and I certainly was not under any obligation to join SWAPO. Of course, I was approached. I believed that my best service would be as an independent person, and I did that through the civil service, and I'm doing that now through directorships. But yes, there are people who believe that. I, for example, have worked on the Harambee Prosperity Plan. And of course, we consider the SWAPO manifesto, it's relevant. But when you go to the extreme of saying you must be a SWAPO card-carrying member, you're going to take instructions from the party like you would be taking instructions from a shareholder, private or public, if they put you there. And that's a dangerous position to be in. So it's much better not to be in that position where you have to take instructions. And that's why the process that's been introduced now is so much better. And I don't believe that there is political override in the selection processes. There might well be, once a board is formed and the chairman has been put in position and is being instructed what to do. But I think we've come a long way past that. And I think people are getting appointed for who they are.
Yeah, indeed. No, I think this has been a very fruitful conversation. I really appreciate your time, Ernestine and Steve. So thank you for coming.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, wonderful. That was the agenda for tonight. Thank you for watching.
My.NA Property Show provides viewers with the best in-class content, engaging interviews, as well as a showcase of the latest property-related products and services. If you would like to feature your brand or your campaign on this platform, contact My.NA at synergy.com.na. My.NA Properties, more than just a roof over your head. My.NA Property Show provides viewers with the best in-class content, engaging interviews, as well as a showcase of the latest property-related products and services. If you would like to feature your brand or your campaign on this platform, contact My.NA at synergy.com.na. My.NA Properties, more than just a roof over your head.
Ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, welcome to another exciting edition.